title that I have is Heat Stress in Farrowing Barns, but I'm going to broaden that a little bit really in what I discuss. Anyway, so my name's Tim Safranski. I'm a swine specialist with the University of Missouri, and I do extension teaching and research, mostly with the breeding herd. I like to set the stage of why heat stress matters. In the scientific literature, there's a paper in 2003 that says it costs the U.S. about $300 million per year. Now, Steve Pullman, when he was still with Murphy Brown, Western Ops, I don't know, 600,000 sows or something, said that seasonality costs me more than PRRS. And that was a really profound statement, I thought, to really help understand the impact of heat. The figure at the bottom is to help us understand that $300 million in 2003, we recognize that feed is the overwhelming largest expense associated with pig production. And between 2003 and 13, that 10-year period, the cost of the two major feed ingredients nearly tripled. And they've not quite gone back down where they were. They're not quite as high as they were in 13, but the 300 million is certainly an underestimate. And those are direct impacts, and I think there's a lot more indirect impacts that we don't acknowledge. So when we think about heat stress, we think about increased sow mortality. We think about delayed puberty, especially in gilts, somewhat in boars. We think about gilts and sows having weaker, shorter, and more irregular estrus cycles. And we know that sows that are heat stressed late in gestation have an increased rate of stillborn pigs. Today, we're going to put a little more emphasis on the farrowing house. And so when we think of the heat stress in farrowing, we know that it decreases lactation feed intake. And so if we decrease feed intake, we likely decrease milk production, which leads to decreased piglet growth. Decreased feed intake also means that the milk that she is producing is coming more from her body. So we have increased weight loss of the sow. And that metabolically sets her up to have a prolonged wean to estrus interval. This is a figure showing 12 months. And again, this is 10 years old, but Steve Meyer prepared this from USDA data, 12 months of sow mortality. And what I use this to kind of show, again, the impact of heat stress. We think of sow mortality, it bounces in that 7 to 9% range until July and August. And in July and August of 06, in this case, it jumped up over 12% at the peak, and then it decreased, but it didn't go back down to that 7 to 9. It was more the 8 or 9%, really into November and December. And so part of the reason that happens is because of the problems in July and August, we've kept animals around that we would have otherwise culled. And what I was trying to find a good set of data to graph out, we'd see a similar figure if we said that prior to that peak was gestation and after that was post-weaning, and that peak was kind of around farrowing. We know that the majority of sow mortality occurs within a week plus or minus of farrowing, and part of that's just the metabolic demand associated with parturition and milk production. It makes everything about the sow more susceptible to stress. So the pig, of course, has a couple of coping mechanisms when they get to temperatures that are above their thermal neutral zone. And down at the bottom, I show that is 50 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit with that 40 to 70% humidity. So throughout Nebraska, that catch most of the summertime. Of course, if they're outside, they're going to seek shade and water or mud. But most of our pigs have been moved inside, and so we accept responsibility for the climate that they're exposed to. And that doesn't mean that we'll always keep it 50 to 70 degrees. And so as the temperature gets above that thermal neutral zone, they cope by increasing blood flow to the skin, which results in an increased skin temperature. They increase their respiration rate, so they breathe faster to exhale both moisture for evaporative loss, but also heat. And then they can have decreased feed intake as well as a mechanism of dealing with stress, heat stress. And if those don't work, then we see an increase in rectal temperature. So we can see a negative impact of heat stress even without an increase in rectal temperature because of that change of blood flow, increase in respiration rate, and decrease in feed intake. But when we get to the point that the rectal temperature increases, that means that they were unable to cope. What we'd really like to do is to identify the heat stress problem before it's a problem. And we can think about respiration rate as being a great way to measure her thermal environment, except that people won't take the time to count respiration rate in sows. So unfortunately, it's a method to actually count and try to quantify. I think is a method that's not likely to be applied in the barns, but certainly we can look, and if they're panting, that's really, they've gotten to the point that we need to intervene. So again, we think of some of those things that we measure in the barn, and we say, how do they actually occur? Well, the not pregnant sows or the reduced litter sizes can be increased embryonic death. So if that heat stress is early in gestation, some of the embryos die. Maybe all of them die, and then she returns to estrus at an irregular time. We can have poor follicular development, and so the follicles in the ovary during lactation, as soon as we wean, we expect that we've removed that suckling inhibition, and then they will grow and ovulate. Those are the next pigs. So if she's subject to heat stress during lactation, we have poor quality follicles. Those result in poor quality oocytes, which then are poor quality embryos. I'm not going to show you any data today about hormone production, but suffice it to say that we have reasonable evidence that under heat stress, hormone production changes, and some of the reproductive hormones are negatively affected. I put on here a larger impact on parity 1 females. That's been demonstrated through all of the heat stress research that's included multiparous and single first parity females. But we think of this especially during lactation because we've got an animal that's more subject to heat stress. We're asking her, she's producing more heat because we're asking her to produce as much milk as the older females, but she's also is continuing to grow. So that's part of what makes her more susceptible. Okay, I'm going to skip the male for today. It's just about embryonic loss during pregnancy. You can look at that. We expect 15 to 25 eggs. Nearly all of them are fertilized. We expect a third or more to die prior to farrowing, and then we'll lose. USDA data will say you'll have 1 pig dead at birth, and you'll lose 1 more before weaning. So these are the USDA data that are now 10 years old, but this is from the NOMS study, and it just shows you those numbers. So, this is U.S. average. I'm sure that the state of Nebraska is above this average. I'm sure that they were in 2007. But again, it shows that 10.5 born alive, so 1 stillborn, and 1 died pre-weaning. This table is from that, and this was identified by the people completing the surveys as what were the causes of those pre-weaning deaths. And you can see that by far the #1 cause was crushing by the sow. And this becomes important in the context of heat stress during farrowing because a sow that's undergoing heat stress is uncomfortable. And a sow that's uncomfortable may get up, and she gets restless. She may get up and down more, so more opportunities for a pig to run underneath. She may also be less careful about how she lays down. Pretty recent data, and this is pigs, the control were maintained at 20 degrees Fahrenheit, which is in the thermoneutral zone. I'm sorry, centigrade. I should have converted these. The heat stressed group went up from about 8 days prior to day 115. They went up to 25 degrees, which is, it's warm, but it's not hot. Okay, and then they gradually decreased back to 20 degrees, and this shows the respiration rate. And so as you see, once temperature goes back down, respiration rate goes back down to normal. And this is certainly within the range, 25, but you're in that's probably like 80 or 82 degrees. Sites on the bottom, this is this is the closest I could get to the sow mortality I was talking about. And so you see proportion of sow mortality relative to days after farrowing. So there's that big peak in that first couple of weeks, and then there's kind of a steady mortality. Then that second peak, that 135 or 140 days, that's the subsequent farrowing. And so again, a lot of the heat stress makes all of these factors worse. A lot of the mortality we talk about is the baby pig, and we know that most of that happens in the first 3 days. It's always at least 50% of the pre-weaning loss in the absence of some E. coli or something. Crushing, starvation, and disease in all research or survey data are the primary causes. And a heat-stressed sow is more likely to be sloppy in the way she lays down. She's less likely to produce adequate milk and poorer quality colostrum. So large litters, when we talk about piglet death, large litters, which we're seeing more and more continually throughout our industry, we know they're going to have prolonged farrowing duration. They're going to have lower birth weight, and they're going to have higher variation in birth weight. Okay, this becomes important because a lot of the heat stress work from 10 years ago has a couple of pigs less per litter. And so heat stress also tends to prolong farrowing. So it's an added stress that the sow is undergoing, makes her uncomfortable sooner. And so she quits having contractions to try to deal with the heat. And then we result in more stillborn pigs. It's an old study, but they looked at uterine exhaustion. And so they had farrowings that were less than 6 hours, had 11.8% pre-wean mortality, and any of them that went over 6 hours had over 20% pre-wean mortality. We'll skip the thermal environment of the baby pig, other than to recognize that that LCT is lower critical temperature. So at birth, if it's below 94 degrees, that baby pig might get chilled. And if you remember, I told you the upper end for the sow was 70 degrees. So that makes the farrowing facility the most difficult to manage thermally, because if we've got conventional farrowing crates, we've got a 5 by 7 foot area that we want at least a 20-degree spread in the temperatures, and that's where we get into our microenvironments and zone heating, etc. Baby pigs have udder seeking, and we think of it in terms of warmth, and probably kind of evolutionarily, if you will, that would have been one of the drivers to keep that baby pig warm. But it's also because of the milk, and they're looking for the smell of the milk. They can feel the direction of the hair on the back when they're born, and which sends them back toward the udder. And the research studies that have measured it say that in the first 24 hours, baby pigs spend 60% of their time touching the udder. Okay? The smaller pigs will spend more of their time than the larger pigs. So think of them being more thermally compromised because they have a larger surface area to volume ratio. This is a study a little bit more recent. I don't have it on here, but I think it was 2014. And they looked for the first 2 hours, they looked at the pigs every 10 minutes. And so these are my photographs, but their data. And I'll just put the numbers up here. What they found in that first 2 hours, that 80% of the time pigs were touching the udder or touching a pig that was touching the udder. So you can think of the photograph on the left. So again, part of that's associated with warmth, part of it's with milk. Remember also the sow's going to let milk down once every hour for about 15 seconds. So if you're touching the udder and she sends the signal the milk's coming, you're far more likely to get a meal than if you're that pig that's off by himself. And we need to consider that when we're thinking about the baby. This is another old study. This is 22 years old, but Trish Holyoke did this at the University of Minnesota. And she looked at the impact of supervising farrowing. So this was induced or non-induced, and it was supervised or unsupervised. And so we talk about attending farrowing to save baby pigs, and it becomes an economic question depending on how much does it cost me to have a person there for extended hours or for 24 hours, and how many baby pigs can I save. And I'm not arguing that every farm needs to attend farrowing, but I think every farm ought to work through the calculations of what it costs and what can they save. With Trish's numbers, the gray are the unsupervised, the black are the supervised, and these are mortality numbers, so lower is better. And you can see, as you would expect, most of the mortality is in the first 3 days, and the supervised ones had considerably less mortality. And trauma was one of their big factors, which is largely getting laid on or stepped on and dying from that injury. I've used her study. There's been a couple other supervision studies, but I used hers because hers also had the induction. And farrowing induction has gotten a lot of bad press, and I'm not going to argue that everybody should induce, but there's multiple induction protocols, and I don't have time to talk about the ones that I think would be appropriate. The appropriate protocol that if it allows us to supervise, I think we need to reflect on it differently. So if we're inducing just to induce, we might expect increased mortality or increased stillborns. But if we're inducing because that's the only way we can supervise, if you see Trish's figure here, the best was this case it's survival, so higher is better. The best was supervised non-induced. So if we provide 24-hour supervision and we're there to attend every baby pig, to provide timely obstetrical intervention, to get every pig warm and dry, to get every pig colostrum, that's the best. The next best was induced and supervised. So non-induced, non-supervised had a lower survival than induced but supervised. Okay, so I put this in here to remind us to think about that. And this becomes, again, more important during the heat times, because that sow's going to have prolonged farrowing. She is going to get uncomfortable sooner, and we need to provide more timely obstetrical intervention. So we've done some work, and some of you have seen some of this. We went out and took temperatures inside commercial barns. This was the pattern across these barns, and then we recreated that thermal environment in our environmental chambers. That top one is our gestation stall, and the bottoms are farrowing crates within these chambers. So pretty conventional sort of setup. And I'm going to show you some of it's the same data, but I'll show you half of it, and then I'll show you all of it. So we had 3 periods. In this case, they came from our research farm, and they moved in the first 3 weeks. They were at either thermal neutral or heat stress. Then they were moved from that gestation to the farrowing, and they were either thermal neutral or heat stress. And then at weaning, they were moved back to the same gestation they came from. So the first one I'm going to show you, we're in those environments the whole time. And this is rectal temperatures. And so a couple things to notice. One is that rectal temperature of heat stressed sows was higher. So they indeed were heat stressed. And the second thing is that in both populations, rectal temperature increased by a full degree centigrade after farrowing. And if we look at respiration rate did not increase the same in those thermal neutral sows. And so the take-home point here, if you look at that spike, both temperature and respiration rate, that's at farrowing basically. So in addition to all the other metabolism, farrowing is a problem. But now this respiration rate in those thermal neutral sows, it's almost back to where it was before, and it suggests that that 1 degree increase in rectal temperature is a new set point. So it's an accepted body temperature change, and then it goes back down again after weaning. Feed intake also deviated in those same populations, and so they were limit fed prior to farrowing. The day after farrowing, we tried to ramp them up as quickly as possible, and we can see the thermoneutral sows indeed ate more. This lumps 2 more groups on there, so they were either thermoneutral or heat stress before and after farrowing, but during farrowing they either stayed. Sorry, I showed you the ones that stayed in the same environment. These include also the ones that switched. So that gold bar that has the highest rectal temperature during lactation, those were in thermal neutral gestation and moved to the heat stress farrowing. And what you can see is, compared to the black ones that were heat stressed all the time, it looked like perhaps there was some failure to be able to adapt to that higher temperature. Because it was more shocking coming from a thermoneutral environment. Feed intake, you can see a similar pattern as I showed you, and indeed piglet weights differed in that those in thermoneutral environments ate more and weaned heavier pigs, presumably because of higher milk production. So we went out to some commercial rooms again, and we looked at what's the body temperature, different time of day. In this case, again, it's degrees centigrade, it doesn't matter. But it's about a half a degree difference in the morning versus the afternoon. And so this is important if we're using temperature as an indicator of well-being, to recognize that's going to happen. And the EC is evaporatively cooled, and the FA is forced air, so just more outside air. And so evaporative cooling worked. It certainly helped them stay cooler by 0.2 of a degree in the rectal temperature, which was meaningful. Showing really from the same study lumped back together, but prior to lactation and during lactation, this is rectal temperatures. And again, I mentioned that parity 1 females are more susceptible to heat stress. Now, this is a study, more of ours in the chambers, where they were subjected to heat stress during gestation only, and then they were all moved together for farrowing. So if we look at the first graph, that's rectal temperature. From the beginning of gestation, they were the same. In 3 or 4 weeks, you can see that those under heat stress were unable to maintain the same rectal temperature, whereas the thermoneutral ones, it continued to go down, and that's a normal pregnancy response. If we look at respiration rate, you can see the thermoneutral ones were comfortable. They kept that 30 breaths per minute. The heat stressed ones got progressively less comfortable. Now, I'm going to show you just a little bit of data where everything I've shown you so far was on those pregnant sows. I'm going to show you a little bit on those piglets. So post-weaning, we took piglets whose mothers were either thermal neutral or heat stressed. Then they farrowed under thermal neutral conditions, and then they were weaned into our research wean finish barn. And we put cameras on them. We measured behavior. So GHS is gestational heat stress. GTN is gestational thermal neutral. If your mother was heat stressed when you were a fetus, you spent more time at the feeder than if your mother was thermal neutral. And so it looked like having a mother heat stressed might have provided you an ability to adapt better to heat stress. There was no difference in daily gain. Those that were gestationally heat stressed grew the same as those that were not. We did not have feed intake on those pigs because they were housed together, but this is their brothers. And what you can see is that the heat stressed pigs, the Gilts spent more time at the feeder, the Barrows ate more, and they also did not grow better. So we recognize that the other thing I told you, that the heat stress is underestimated, the impact. And I think beyond just because we don't have all the math on it, I think the biology, we're not to the point where we really understand the long-term impact of heat stress on the pig. So I gave a talk about solving the heat stress problem, and there's, that's just do everything right every day and it goes away. But some people say that's hard to do, and I recognize that they're probably right. So it just shows you some things to think about. One of the approaches has been genetically. So this is the left y-axis is the farrowing rate. This is from a genetics company, and they had a couple different populations they evaluated. The x-axis is the temperature, the average outside temperature on the day of insemination. And what they have is the dashed line is what they call their high productive line, and the solid line is what they call their low productive line. And what you can see is up until about 22 or 3 degrees, the high productive line was more productive. But once it got hot, they really suffered. And so you can think of this as an animal that's got that suffers more from heat stress, probably at least partially because it's producing more heat itself metabolically. This is an animal with a higher farrowing rate. If I recall correctly, it was 2 pigs, higher litter size, etc. But certainly genetically, and this is with, they straightened it out kind of statistically speaking, you can see at 20 degrees or 19.2 is the upper critical temperature. After that, farrowing rate was impacted. Okay, and this is outside temperature, so inside is probably somewhat higher. So what do we do? Well, we think about, I don't have on here a farrowing facility with bedding. We do have some of those, and we may be having more of those, but I want to just think about some of the things that long-term we might think about, but short-term, we've got the farrowing facilities we got, and it's the middle of July. So, if we have bedding, we certainly back off some on the bedding in the summer, or our sows don't stay in the farrowing facility. And most of our bedded ones are provide some outdoor access for the sows, and they don't spend as much time with the pigs. But kind of conventionally, if we look at the upper left, it's the plastic floor and the cast iron under the sow. So the cast iron is both stronger and cooler. And generally, we like this for the sow. This is probably the most popular setup going in Missouri. The only times this is a problem is when it gets too hot. And when it's too hot for the pigs and we're above their thermoneutral zone, which if you look there later in farrowing was down into the 70s, now the pigs might start to lay on that metal instead of the plastic. So if we look at the upper right figure, that's an all plastic floor. Now that creep area has some heated concrete, but where the sow and most of the pigs would be is plastic. So it's the same everywhere. And so there's not an area that might be cooler. The bottom left, they have some kind of plastic on the left and metal on the right and metal under the sow. And I'm just to stretch you a little bit, I'll show you the bottom right. That's from a company, I think they're a Belgian company, Nguyen. And that's a set that really goes down, essentially replaces half of that cast iron under the sow. And the bottom of the bottom right is the bottom side of that. And so it's got a water line. And so this is designed to just run cool water through under her shoulders to help cool the sow without cooling the pigs. There are a few of these in the United States. I only know of 6 that we bought for a research trial with boars. And they do help to cool the boars. And it'll be interesting to see if we think of other ways to cool. And I'm sure some of you might have been around when we ran warm water underneath the floors for the baby pigs, and now we're thinking running cool for the sows. We can think about air conditioning, and if you work with bore studs, you have at least considered it. The value of heat stress on the bores is so much greater that we can afford that. With our sows, I don't see us going that way. So what do we have for ventilation? Let's look at fan controls, making sure they're set right. Let's make sure that inlets are clean. If we look at fan blades and shrouds, the engineers tell me that we can reduce airflow by 20 to 40% by having dusty fans. So we can reduce the capacity to less than 80% of rated capacity. If we have drippers, are they running at the designed rate? I get on a lot of them here in Missouri that don't have as many drippers, but that have the hard water and they're plugged up, and they go, well, they aren't all working. And so for that one sow that has one option for a place to be, she doesn't have cooling in that case. And then, of course, if we have cool cells, not just making sure that they're wet, because if they're not wet, they're not cooling, but also making sure that the incoming air is coming through the cool cell. If we've got enough gaps in the curtain, holes in the curtain, or doors open going to other barns, other places that air can come in, then that air won't come through the cool cell. Okay, so we've got to think about that and seal that up as tightly as we can to draw the air through the cool cell. A lot of farms here in Missouri have gone to automated feeding, and farms that we thought were doing a pretty good job with lactation feed intake tend to see about a 10% increase. And so if we're doing a poor job with feeding sows 3 or 4 or 5 times a day and et cetera, then we might see even larger increases. And this is just a figure kind of demonstrating one of the reasons why. If we come in and the feeder is empty at our first feeding at 6 in the morning, what does that mean? Well, you can see if we left it at noon, there's 38% of the daily feed intake, that 20 plus the 18. Depending on how much we left, she could have run out quite a bit earlier. So that's one of the ways that we see an increase in that. So just something else to think about. Most of our farrowing sows eat throughout the day. And depending on the temperature, what you'll see is a shift. So that 6 to noon would go down from the 6 p.m. to midnight as the temperature gets hotter during the day, because there's heat associated both with eating and digesting feed. So what do? Well, we want to maximize feed intake for milk production, and we might consider feeding different times of the day, more meals, more smaller meals. We might consider wet feed. Some farms find that to work, some don't. But we need to consider whatever we can do to help encourage lactation feed intake so that she makes milk from feed rather than from her body. There's some other things we do. We can think about exogenous hormones, and this kind of the transition from the farrowing back to breeding gestation. PG600 is labeled and approved for use in non-cycling females, so prepubertal gilts, stale gilts, or the sow that's not cycling. Sometimes people like to give a shot of PG600 at weaning, and my challenge to that is that when do they quit that again? And it's a $5 or $6 a dose treatment. So we have to say, how many sows are we benefiting by treating all of the sows? So another way is to say anything that doesn't cycle within the first 10 days or 9 days or 12 days, whatever the number, gets the PG600. So that saves us PG600. It does add non-productive days on that group of sows. If we're a farm that's using Ovugel, there's added value to PG600 because we are going to inseminate them regardless of whether they're returning to estrus. So if this brings us 15, 20% more sows coming into heat in 4 to 7 days, those are the only ones that will respond to Ovugel. That's, again, a different economics question. Other things to think about relative to farrowing, moving of sows, both in and out. We might need to really think about time of day of doing that, and especially the moving them in, coming in extra early in the morning. The feeding content I mentioned before, cool cells and drippers, whatever we have for a cooling system for the sow, we just need to make sure that it's working as well as it can. And it's not going to be air conditioning. If you got air conditioning in the sow farm, I'd love to talk to you. But and then the other thing is to check flow rates, and especially in farrowing, we have lots of nipple waters in farrowing. and we want them to run at least a quart a minute. Some people will say 2 quarts a minute, but at least a quart a minute. And the only way to check that is when sows are drinking, going to the nipples at the end of the line and seeing, is it flowing at that rate? That's water flow rate. Then we need to check each nipple and make sure that it hasn't gotten plugged with rust or scum or whatever else might have gotten in there. The nipple hasn't just malfunctioned. If we can cool the water, that's even better. And if we come in and we look at water lines running along the ceiling and it's the middle of the afternoon in July, that water is likely not as cool as it was when it went there, and the sows will not drink as much of the warm water. So what do we do today? So, it's middle of July and the sows are moving in. We've already got our floors in, etc. There's only so much you can do, but I would encourage everybody today or tomorrow to get back out and just check the cooling system, the drippers, the misters, the cool cells, whatever you're using, making sure it's working as well as it can. Encourage you to consider feeding options if you don't have automated feeding, thinking about how frequently you're feeding and whether or not going to wet feed is even an option. I would encourage you to consider measuring sow comfort. I think a lot of people don't really reflect on that, but really looking at those sows and saying, hey, are they as cool as they can be? So today our heat index in Missouri is going to be over 100 degrees, and tomorrow as well. It's going to be our worst stretch of the season so far. And quite frankly, it's kind of miserable outside. Doing whatever we can to make sure cool water is available. If you've not swapped out your 200-watt heat lamp bulbs for lower watt ones, you can. Your rooms, you don't need that higher wattage heat lamp when the room's already 85 degrees. Bottom, I say, if you do everything right every day, most of our problems go away. And what I find with producers is that most of them, if they really think about it and if they had time, they could probably do everything right every day. And then the question becomes, in the real world, how much can we do today? And so with that, I'd be happy to reflect back or answer questions or whatever else you can. These are the sources of funding for the work from Mizzou that I showed you.
Dr. Benny Moe is asking, could you discuss the use of misters in farrowing rooms? How often and flow, etc.?
So off the top of my head, I don't know what a flow rate would be on a mister. Challenge you have with the water direct on the sow cooling systems in farrowing is that what you want to do is wet the sow, but you don't want to wet the pigs. So partly you don't want to chill them, but also you don't want to create a wet environment because you can think of whatever bacteria you want. I usually think of E. coli, but that's where they're going to thrive. And so I think more of drippers than misters. And we think of something in the neighborhood of not more than 0.8 gallons an hour. And so the idea with the cooling in farrowing is to not cool the sow with water, but to cool her with evaporation. So our goal is to have the water, and typically we go to the neck because there's a lot of blood flow there, and because it's away from the udders where the piglets are likely to be. So typically what we'd like is for the water to drip on the neck and evaporate before the next drop comes. And so we're counting on evaporation off of her neck to be the cooling, not the water itself. Misters would be the same concept, but I guess I've not worked with a system that has a mister that stays completely on the sow. And I think if we've got something that's getting the moisture onto the pigs, that just seems like it'd be a real challenge to manage. Again, the biggest challenge I see with drippers in farrowing, here in Missouri, we've got hard water. So the big advantage to a cool cell over a dripper is that the workers, whoever's taking care of the pigs, knows whether it's working or not. Because when you walk in that room, you can tell if the cool cell is working. The room feels much better. The drippers, we have to physically look at every one, ideally every day, right? But certainly a couple of times throughout our season, we need to make sure that those drippers are actually dripping.
Thank you, Tim, for all the knowledge you shared with us. We greatly appreciate your time and willingness to present to us and talk about the different issues with heat stress and how to help prevent them. At this time, I'm seeing no other questions, so I will say thank you again and have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thank you.